The semester's going well for everyone. I'm really excited to have Mr. Steve Kilgore with us today. Steve is the Senior Vice President for Outpatient and Retail Operations at Mountain States, meaning he's part of the most senior management team there. And at this time of the merger, probably one of the most important positions for the future of this region. Mr. Kilgore is also the President and CEO of the Blue Ridge Medical Management Corporation, which is a wholly owned subsidiary of Mountain States, and a really and remarkably complex organization. I've had the pleasure of joining their board a few months ago and have come to realize the incredible impact that Blue Ridge has, and of course Mountain States has, on our region. Mr. Kilgore has a 30-year history in all aspects of health administration, particularly around physician management practices, acquisition. I mean, really a remarkable career. Any of you all who are interested, even potentially interested in a career around health administration, are going to learn a great deal from Mr. Kilgore. He got his undergraduate degree from what was then King College in Business Administration Economics, and an MBA from Milligan. More importantly, he has an adjunct appointment in the Department of Health Services Management and Policy. So please join me in welcoming Mr. Steve Kilgore.
Thank you. Thank you.
I'll sit back.
Okay. Well, thank you. Really a pleasure to be here this morning, and appreciate the opportunity to come and talk to you guys a little bit about Mountain States Health Alliance, Blue Ridge Medical Management Corporation. I'll make a few comments about our merger. Seems like everywhere I go, that's obviously on people's minds. Where are we with the merger? What's the status and so forth? And we've had, even this week, some updates to all of that work. So I'll take a few moments and speak about that as well. And then I thought I would maybe just share a few comments and thoughts with you about some of the physician trends that we see. And as you'll see as I go through the presentation material, that's one of the areas where I end up spending a great deal of time is around our physician activity, our physician organization. So keep this really light, informal. I'll move around a little bit, and if you have any questions, feel free to stop me. This is not a real formal presentation, so feel free to throw your hand up, ask me any questions as I go through this, and then obviously at the end of the presentation we'll have time for questions as well. So I thought I would start with, and again, can you all see this okay, or do we need to? Of course, the risk of turning the lights down is it is early in the morning, and I understand that. Is that better? I thought I would maybe start with just a little bit of an overview of Mountain States Health Alliance. Many of you in the room probably are already aware of some of this, but just to sort of set the stage for some of the comments and material that I have a little bit later. So just a reminder of where we are with Mountain States. We actually have 14 hospitals now rather than 13 here. This slide needs to be updated since our recent affiliation with Laughlin Memorial down in Greenville. And then of course we've got the region's only children's hospital. I won't take the time to read every piece of information here, but we do cover a 29 county service area across 4 states. A little over $1 billion in revenue in Mountain States Health Alliance. And then within Mountain States Medical Group, which is one part of Blue Ridge I'll speak about here in a few moments, 104 locations, almost 400 employed providers now, which makes us probably the largest employer of physicians, certainly in this region. And that's grown significantly, as you'll see here in a few moments, over the years. About 62,000 or so total admissions throughout our health system, over 250,000 ER visits, and you can see the number of outpatient visits, almost 2 million now. And this map just sort of depicts our service area and where we have facilities located. I noticed out on the board, the Department of Public Health has certainly a mission statement, a vision statement, and a number of different values, much like we do at Mountain States Health Alliance. I won't read all of this, but I will say that this is something that our board at Mountain States Health Alliance reviews on a regular basis. Usually each year when we do our board retreat, there's a considerable amount of time spent discussing our mission, vision, values to ensure that we still believe that those are the things that we hold really close and dear to our mission and what we're about in terms of providing care across the region. So These are important and they play directly into our strategic plan. So we actually follow a very specific strategic planning process. These are the 6 pillars, if you will, that we've identified. What we do in Mountain States, every entity, every facility, so if it's Johnson City Medical Center, or if it's Indian Path Medical Center, or if it's Blue Ridge Medical Management, we have the following 6 pillars, and then underneath each of those, we identify specific strategic initiatives that are intended to help us achieve our goals, our mission, and so forth over the coming year. And so these are the 6 pillars that we've identified, and much like we do with any of the other organizations in Mountain States, Blue Ridge does the same. And then, of course, we report on those as we go through the year to our boards in terms of how we're progressing against our strategic plans. Again, a little bit of an eye chart here, but just to give you some idea for FY17, our fiscal year ends in June. So for the year ended in June 2017, Mountain States, you can see again about 61,000 admissions or so. I've already covered the ER visits, a little over 250,000, and now outpatient visits over 1,000,008 in terms of total. You know, this is a slide that I think is particularly important and something I wanted to just say a couple of things about. And I think this helps to sort of size up where we are in our market here and what's going on nationally in terms of utilization. And so if you look here at 2017, you can see that we're still running in Mountain States about 116 per thousand in terms of inpatient utilization rates. And if you look at what the national average is, you can see there's still a pretty good gap here of about 15 or so. Now, clearly, our trend has been down, but the truth of the matter is, in this region, we still see utilization rates that are significantly above what we're seeing across the country. We anticipate, obviously, as you can see here, over the next 4 to 5 years, that those inpatient utilization rates are going to continue to decline. And you say, well, why is that? Well, the obvious answer is, as more and more care gets pushed outside the hospital into more outpatient settings and so forth, you're going to see these inpatient utilization rates continue to drop. And so it really requires you, from an administrative management perspective, to come at this a little bit different in terms of your mindset about how you typically think about volume. As we move further and further into this value-based world, you know, the shift from volume to value that you guys have probably heard about, you're going to continue to see these trends. And it's really important for us because we still, you know, we sit here today with 14 hospitals, soon to be 21. The fixed costs that exist with those assets, recognizing that we're going to see inpatient utilization rates continue to decline. So it puts a lot of, certainly a lot of focus and certainly a lot of pressure on operations in that regard. Just a couple of things. I have one slide in here about Ballad Health in terms of our merger, and I think all of you probably are aware of the fact that we're moving forward with our merger with Wellmont. And it's a little bit hard to believe that standing here now 3 years later, we actually first announced our intentions to merge 3 years ago. It's taken us that long to get to where we are today. So we did get the state of Tennessee to approve the Certificate of Public Advantage, COPA for short, back in September. There is similar legislation in Virginia. It's called a cooperative agreement. We actually got approval from Virginia. There was the order was approved actually just this Monday from Virginia. So now we're in the process of going through the document from Virginia, sort of matching that up against what we've already received from Tennessee in terms of the terms of certification. And now we've got to start the work of trying to make sense of those documents and how they support one another, where there's areas of duplication, where there's areas that's going to require additional work, and so forth. And so we anticipate the closing probably sometime in January. There's a 30-day period that after Virginia approval on Monday, there's a 30-day public period for folks to comment and so forth, and it didn't take us that long, frankly, to go through the document and try to understand some of the requirements and the conditions that have been placed on the merger from Virginia. But the terms of certification from the state of Tennessee is 116 pages. And so if you're really sleepy one night and you're having trouble going to sleep, you can access that document, and trust me, within a few pages you'll be sound asleep. But it's really full of lots of commitments that we have made, along with requirements that the state has made on our on ballot on the new health system in terms of the commitments that we've made. I've highlighted just a few things. You know, we've committed over $300 million over 10 years in several areas. I've highlighted those here. Really, the first three are really about access. And if you look in the terms of certification document, that's really sort of how they characterize these three. So in the case of behavioral health, you can see we've committed about $85 million over 10 years. This is really about community-based mental health services, expanding those services throughout the region. And this requires, the terms of certification require us to submit to the state a behavioral health plan. I think this one is due within 6 months. Most of these require actual plans to be developed, submitted to the state for approval, and most of them are within the first 6 months. We do have a couple that maybe give us 12 months, but nonetheless, lots of work that's going to be involved in each of these. Children's services, $27 million over 10 years, expanding children's services, our children's hospital, recruiting some of the pediatric subspecialists that we think the region needs and can support. Rural health services, $28 million over 10 years. There was a good bit said about rural health services in the terms of certification. And one of the things that was pointed out, and I'll speak to this here in a moment, is that there were many counties in our geographic service area that are medically underserved. And we agree with that, particularly in some of the rural areas. And so a lot of investment that we'll be making over the next 10 years or so is designed to address that. And frankly, in order for us to achieve many of the population health initiatives that we have outlined, it's going to require additional resources in those markets. 85 million or so over 10 years in health research, G&E. Again, continued support of the residency. Lots of research opportunities here we want to try to take advantage of and position the new organization. Certainly working with organizations like ETSU and the institutions, the Department of Public Health and others that certainly have a lot of focus around research and education. Population health, 75 million over 10 years. And really that's tied a lot into the health index you see here. There are 69, I think it's 69 clinical quality metrics that we are going to be held accountable for, that we have to achieve. Some of those are access measures, some of them are more population health focused around tobacco use, teen pregnancy, et cetera. And so we're going to be held accountable to meeting certain thresholds, certain measures in that regard. We've got 8 million or so committed to a region-wide health information exchange. This does not include the probably $150 to $200 million that we'll be investing in a common IT platform with Wellmont. But this is essentially around the appropriate exchange of patient information among providers across the region, which again helps us get at total cost of care, improving care, and so forth. So, that's, I could go on, I could probably spend all day just on the entire merger and the documents, but that gives you some idea of some of the work that will be taken on here over the next 60 to 90 days as we move closer to a closing date. Okay, I want to sort of flip over now to Blue Ridge Medical Management, which, as Dr. Wyckoff mentioned, is one of my primary areas of responsibility, and frankly is probably one of the more complicated entities in the United States Health Alliance, simply because we have a lot of different business units in Blue Ridge. Certainly the hospitals are complicated as well, but Blue Ridge is a wholly owned for-profit subsidiary of the United States Health Alliance. You can see it was formed back in the early 90s. And then in about 4 or 5 years later, the charter was amended and the name was changed to Blue Ridge Medical Management Corporation. Wholly owned for-profit subsidiary of Mountain States Health Alliance. You can see a little over 1,000 team members among all the different companies that are in Blue Ridge today. We have an annual budget of a little over $250 million. And out of the encounters that you saw on the previous slide with Mountain States, out of the 1,000,008 or so, about a third of those are really attributed to our practices in Blue Ridge. So these are a list of the primary entities that make up Blue Ridge today. Obviously, Mountain States Medical Group is one of the primary things and probably the one that you may be most familiar with. So that is our integrated physician network. We have about roughly 400 employed providers, physicians and mid-levels, nurse practitioners, physician assistants, etc. Over 100 locations, as you saw a moment ago, and various specialties all over the board. One of the things that's important, I think, to point out is we typically in Mountain States Medical Group don't add, we really don't recruit physicians or acquire practices unless it's really a strategic initiative of one of our hospitals. So we don't get up in the morning and say, hey, I've got a great idea, let's go recruit some physicians. It's typically driven specifically from a strategic plan from one of our hospitals in their markets. But we have grown significantly over the years. All of our primary care sites are level 3 NCQA recognized medical homes. And so we're proud of that. A lot of work went into that effort. Mountain States Properties, as you'll see in a moment, I've got a little description about what that is. It's essentially our real estate company. The Wellness Center, many of you are familiar with, over on the state of Franklin, that sits up above the road there. We have that is actually part of Blue Ridge, along with the center that we have over in Carter County on the campus in Sycamore Shoals. MediServe Durable Medical Equipment and Respiratory is also a Blue Ridge company. We have 3 offices. Our primary office is out in Gray. And then Mountain States Pharmacy is our retail pharmacy. We have, I think it's 5, maybe 6 locations now. Health Pro Staffing Agency is a company that we started a number of years ago, largely to address the growing reliance that we found ourselves faced with temporary staffing, particularly with nursing or travelers, which tends to be a fairly expensive solution. And so we started our own staffing agency, and that's actually done very well. Obviously, our primary client is Mountain States Health Alliance, but nonetheless. And then we have a number of different joint ventures that are included in Blue Ridge as well. Some of those, a number of them actually are ambulatory surgery centers. We have about 3 of those here in Washington County, a couple over in Sullivan County. There's 5 or 6 joint venture surgery centers where we partner with surgeons in that market around outpatient ambulatory surgery centers. And all of those have been really successful. And it's allowed us to align and continue a relationship and partner with physicians and at least retain some piece of the revenue as opposed to having all of that loss. And then we do joint venture one of our urgent care centers. We have 9 total. One of those out in Piney Flats is actually a joint venture. So Mountain States Medical Group, again, about 400 providers, 104 locations, 9 urgent care sites. You can see the number of specialties all across the board. And again, a lot of those, most of them are actually driven from a need that we have had in a particular community. This is very difficult for you to see, but it basically takes the same 29 county area that I mentioned a moment ago from a facility perspective and starts to show you sort of where we have clinics. So we have clinics all over the region. And again, you know, everywhere we have facilities as far north as Smith County or all the way down to Greenville, most of those have physicians in their market that we employ. Some of those existed before we even got there. So for example, in Greenville, which is with Laughlin, our most recent relationship, they had about a dozen physicians that they already employed before we even affiliated with Laughlin. Those will now become part of our organization, and much the same was the case in Abingdon when we acquired Johnson Memorial and up in Norton, Virginia as well. This will give you some idea of sort of what our trend has been just over the last 3 or 4 years. So I've been at Mountain States 20 years. When I first came, I think we had 45 or maybe 50 employed physicians, or providers rather. And so we're almost 400 today. So this just gives you some idea over the last 3 or 4 years. So again, just real quickly, Mountain States Properties, I mentioned, today we own or manage about 600,000 square feet or so of space. Most of those are medical office buildings. So if you go on the campus at Johnson City Medical Center, or if you go on the campus at Indian Path Medical Center in Kingsport, you'll see medical office buildings all around. Most of those assets are owned by Blue Ridge. And so we have essentially a real estate division that owns those assets, that manages those. And you can see there's about 35 properties or so that we own or manage in that entity. The Wellness Center I've already mentioned with the 2 locations, MediServe, and then Mountain States Pharmacy with our retail locations. Health Pro Staffing I mentioned, and then the joint ventures I sort of already touched on in terms of the surgery centers. Kingsport Day Surgery is on the campus at Indian Path. We partner with a number of surgeons there. It's not a single specialty surgery center. It's really a lot of different pain procedures, ENT, GI, orthopedics, etc. Mountain Empire Surgery Center is more focused around orthopedics. So our 2 joint venture partners there are the 2 orthopedic groups here in town. And then I've already mentioned Piney Flats Urgent Care. So I thought I would spend a little bit of time and talk about some of the trends that we see from a physician perspective, given the fact that that's a lot of the areas I have responsibility for. It's been really interesting to see what these trends look like over the years, and depending on who you talk to, there's all sorts of data and research and papers that have been that have written about the coming physician shortage. And so the question is, do we really have a physician shortage staring at us, or do we not? And I personally think that we do. You can see here the American Association of Medical Colleges back in, I guess, whenever, I can't remember the year, well, actually it was in April this year, actually project a shortfall from 40 to just over 100,000 physicians, depending on how you want to count it, primary care and or specialists. The University of Pennsylvania did a study recently that said that there could actually be a surplus. So I mean, that's a pretty wide difference of opinion, right? I mean, 100,000 physician shortage versus a surplus. The University of Pennsylvania, I think, is primarily talking about some of the new models of care, and if those were fully deployed, that there could, in fact, maybe be a surplus. And I think a lot of that is around what I mentioned a moment ago, these new models of care that we're seeing now deployed throughout medical practice, whether it be patient-centered medical home, team-based care, where you really have a team-based approach, increasing panel size for the team to be responsible for caring for. So I think this is really speaking to the fact that there are new models of care that could potentially alleviate some of the physician shortage we see. What I will tell you is, if you talk to hospital executives across the country, in most cases, and certainly here, they will tell you that this is an area they are concerned about, particularly from a primary care perspective. And as we get a little bit further into some of the information here, and I'm sure this is something you all talk a lot about from a population health perspective, who's going to be providing that care? It's going to be primary care providers. It's going to be family physicians, internists. It's going to be nurse practitioners. It's going to be PAs. It's going to be truly this team-based approach where you're really involving other pharmacy, clinical pharmacy, nutritional folks, behavioral, et cetera, really with a focus on managing the entire population across the continuum. And so you can see a vast majority of hospital executives that were surveyed expect a shortage of physicians over the next 10 years. On top of that, what we're seeing is a lot of physicians who have been in practice now for a number of years beginning to cut back for various reasons. Particularly the older physicians and I'll speak to this here in a moment, about their plans to cut back, to maybe pursue other options, taking non-clinical jobs. Some of them are actually retiring. And you say, well, why is that? Well, it has a lot to do with the changes that are going on in the industry, right? I mean, there's increased regulation, the reimbursement landscape is changing, the management hassles that go on with it. Technology, while certainly it's going to be a friend ultimately and can be a real powerful vehicle to help us achieve a lot of the things that we're going to be responsible for, but at least for the older generation, is a real, it's a real burden for them. It's a real hurdle. And so it's creating this burnout factor among a lot of those physicians. So, you know, when you lay this on top of sort of what we see from a recruiting perspective, it's very concerning. On top of that, and you see here with the 2016 graduating students, a large percentage of them have debt. We're seeing the amount of that debt slowly, steadily increase. I guess some could argue it's not even slow, but it certainly is steady, and that is influencing what their decisions are in terms of what they want to pursue relative to practice. I think it puts more pressure on the primary care folks, who are typically not as well paid as the specialists and the subspecialists, as we all know, and so they're looking for ways that they can address this debt burden that they've taken on in a way that that influences their choice, you know, in terms of what they want to go into with their practice. Merritt Hawkins, some of you may know or have heard of Merritt Hawkins, a large recruiting firm. You can see these are the top 8 searches nationally that they, and so there's a common thread that runs through these, right? I mean, there's a lot of primary care folks on here. Family medicine, psychiatry, internal medicine, nurse practitioners, hospitalists, which again is over the last number of years has been a growing trend to see more and more physicians pursuing this particular line of work. I would probably put that in a primary care category, and so this is sort of what we're seeing from a recruiting standpoint. In 2015, Merritt Hawkins surveyed their medical residents, and you can see here about 70% of them said that geography was the main driver for where they're going to go. And so, again, I'll bring this back to sort of what we see at Mountain States with the number of rural facilities that we have and the number of rural areas that we're going to be responsible for from a population health perspective. It's just very difficult to recruit physicians to some of those communities. So if I'm trying to recruit physicians to Norton, Virginia, or to Smith County, while those are great communities, we're competing against folks all across the country who have already said geography is a main driver for them. And so that certainly adds a significant amount of pressure on what we're able to do and what we're able to achieve. You can see only 3% choose to practice in the community of 25,000 or less. It's just the national data. So again, it makes it really difficult for us, and it just underscores the importance of having a recruiting plan to try to get at some of our needs across the region. 40% of them say they're totally unprepared for the business side of medicine. That's sort of scary. I don't know that that's changed a great deal, frankly, over the years. I've always felt like that was an area where there was maybe some deficit, but the rate of change that we're seeing in our industry today, I think has further exacerbated this, at least in the minds of many physicians. And then you start seeing numbers like 90% concerned about having any free time in their practice, 90% concerned about healthcare reform, 70% concerned about debt. So again, you take all these things into consideration in terms of what we're trying to do from a recruiting perspective, and it's quite a challenge. Final year residents, this is from 2014, almost half said they had been contacted more than 100 times about practice opportunities. Kind of gives you some idea of what we're up against from a competition standpoint. I was just talking to a neurosurgeon that we've been recruiting that has, she is completing a fellowship in complex spine reconstruction, extremely well trained, and she's got it narrowed down. We're one of her finalists, but she told me that she had 76 separate offers that she had to sort of to work her way through. Now, I'm guessing, I didn't ask her, but I'm guessing some of those, geography or whatever the particulars might have been, allowed her to narrow that down somewhat, but it just kind of gives you some idea of what you're up against from a recruiting perspective. Another trend, and this is particularly something that we have seen and experienced, I think we'll continue to see this. The number of physician practices owned by hospitals and health systems jumped 86% from 2012 to 2015. You can see the number of physicians employed by hospitals during that same time. Today, I think the stat I saw is 1 in 4 medical practices. 25% of the medical practices in this country today are owned by hospitals or health systems. And I think 40%, the number I saw recently was 40% of physicians who are practicing in the United States are employed by a hospital or health system today. And this is a trend that we've seen over the last several years really gain a lot of momentum. And there's a couple of slides in here about sort of what's underlying that as well in terms of what's driving that, both from a hospital or health system perspective as well as what's driving it from the physician perspective. You can see a lot of the hospital folks, executives across the country that are involved in these recruiting efforts and acquisition of practices see this as critical for them to achieve their mission or to implement some of the more value-based arrangements that they're being faced with today from payers. And I think this is an interesting thing as well. Merritt Hawkins reviewed in the 2017 survey, almost 40%, which is increased, and it's going to continue to increase, of physicians have specific performance metrics in their employment agreements, particularly around value-based efforts. So, you know, as we move further and further into a value-based environment, the analogy I like to use, and I've actually seen people put this on a slide now, maybe that's where I saw it originally, I don't know, but it, I think it sort of gave a good example of what the landscape looks like today. So it's 1 foot, you got 1 foot on the dock, and the other foot's on the boat as the boat is pulling away. And the foot on the dock is meant to represent fee for service. I mean, that's essentially the environment that we've operated in for years, right? The more you do, the more you get paid, hospitals, physicians, and the like. And what we're seeing now, whether it's Medicare Shared Saving or Medicare Advantage, all the payers, is this move toward more value-based contracts, which pay you for performance, pay you on the basis of your outcomes, not as much on the volume of work you do. Now today, at least in our market, we still are largely in a fee-for-service, a volume type of world in terms of reimbursement. But we're seeing more and more of the payers now move more into these risk-based arrangements where we are fully at risk for, in some cases, total cost of care. And so it's very important, if we're going to be taking on that kind of responsibility, that we have alignment with our providers, and that many of the metrics and the ways that they're going to be compensated are also aligned with some of the contracting requirements that we have. So you're going to see this percentage go up even further. There's 3 things I listed here. There are more, but these are 3 things that I think also are sort of with regard to recruiting. One is this generational change. I mean, the fact is the millennials and the younger physicians just simply don't view the practice of medicine like their older colleagues. They just don't. They view it as a job. It's an 8 to 5 type of thing, and they want to go home and be with their families. And who can blame them? But that adds another layer of complexity to the recruiting. I mean, if you're going to be successful recruiting in an environment that is so competitive, your organization better be aware of this and recognize it and be prepared to deal with it as best you can in terms of the opportunities that you're creating for that group of physicians. The second thing is rising subspecialization. I mean, and this sort of, these are all connected. So there just aren't as many physicians who are interested in working whatever it is, 14, 16 hours, taking call. And so they tend to migrate more towards specialties where they don't have to take on those responsibilities and those burdens. And that we're going to continue to see that. Now, where do you typically see that? It's typically with family practice, it's surgery, it's those kind of things that typically require call and some of the increased responsibilities, which again puts further pressure on the primary care piece in terms of recruiting and making sure you've got the resources in place to do all the work that's necessary. And then the third thing is a higher performance bar. It's not enough to just be an excellent clinician. I mean, hopefully that's what we're recruiting to begin with, are people who are well-trained, they're great clinicians, but because of the increased focus on performance and value, you are really looking for physicians who buy into that and who are committed to following, for example, evidence-based medicine, practice protocols, who support team-based care and some of the newer models that are being developed. And so you've got a number of things here that add even another layer of difficulty with regard to some of the recruiting efforts. So why are hospitals, health systems across the country, why do they have such a voracious appetite to take on physicians, employ them, acquire practices? Most hospitals on average will lose $200,000 or more for every single physician that they employ. That's the average. Why do they do that? Well, in some cases, it's to expand their service capabilities clearly in the market that they're in, and they feel like the best way to do that is to well, in some cases, as you'll see here, community need, for example, that may be the only way. I would tell you that in a market like Norton, Virginia, if we did not recruit and add some of the physicians that we felt like were necessary in that market, it's very likely that market wouldn't have the physician. It's just not likely that many physicians would just land there. So the other thing is insurance related. In some cases, you got payer relationships that provide some type of an incentive, or there's some underlying compelling reason for you to take on employment or acquisition of a practice. Certainly, it's an alignment tool for hospitals and health systems to align with specific physicians or specific physician groups, so that you have a tighter relationship. Certainly, the downstream referrals that are a result of that can be very important. Although you cannot compensate, as you probably know, you cannot compensate physicians for the volume or the value of those referrals. Clearly, it is an alignment strategy. And then, of course, to increase market share. I mean, if you're acquiring physicians that have a footprint in a particular market, there is an opportunity for you to get your arms around those. Now, here's the other thing, without getting too into the weeds, too granular, but in a population health world, or in a value-based world, and of course, in our case, we do have an ACO here. Our physicians at Mountain States Medical Group are responsible for about 2/3 of the covered lives in that ACO, Medicare Shared Savings Plan, and we've been very successful. We've achieved shared savings in all 4 years that we've been in that particular contract with Medicare. Probably one of a handful across the country, frankly, that have achieved shared savings in all of the years that we have participated. And so that's going to be very important as we go forward, because the primary care folks are essentially how those patients are attributed. And so again, from a hospital or health system, part of their idea, part of the rationale is more primary care affiliation, more alignment with those folks, more attributed lives, more opportunity for us as we go further and further into a value-based world to have some piece of that revenue stream going forward. And of course, why physicians are selling. We've talked a little bit about this a moment ago. Again, just trust me. I mean, reimbursement is not going up at the same rate as operating overhead. Physicians know this. It's an ongoing concern. They work harder and harder to just earn what they've earned, or in many cases earn less. That's a real concern. That's one of the reasons they're seeking relationships or employment. And as I mentioned, continued pressure on reimbursement. There's an old joke around the RBS thing, which really stood for really bad reimbursement very soon. I think a lot of physicians would probably agree with that. Capital is a real issue. If you're going to be taking on electronic health records or do the kind of things you need to do in a clinic setting to continue to invest in the practice, capital is a concern. Where do you get the capital? How do you pay it back? Particularly in an environment where reimbursement's going down, you got to work harder. So that's a real concern. The hassle, just the management hassle that's involved. Many physicians are just tired of dealing with it. They're ready to do something different. And then the security that a relationship with a hospital or health system might offer in terms of the employment agreement itself, the ability to shed all that responsibility from a management perspective. Just come in, see patients, do what you do best, be paid for it, go home. Pretty attractive to a lot of folks. And so these are some of the advantages as a result of doing that for physicians. Certainly, the practice may be more viable than it was previously. And it's not just hospitals and health systems. I mean, you're also seeing a lot of independent, smaller practices, even solo practices that are joining larger groups and so forth for some of these same reasons, to create a more viable future for themselves, relieve themselves of the administrative burden. It's certainly getting more complicated to make sure that you've got the resources in place to navigate all of these changes. We've got now just recently with CMS and the macro and MIPS responsibility that's going to be, that's actually already in place now in terms of measurement. So, and the stress certainly is a factor. More time off, that's something that can typically be negotiated by a physician in an employment arrangement. Today, if you're in practice and you take time off, guess what? You're not getting paid, right? You're not generating revenue. And so in an employment arrangement, you can negotiate some time off, and then certainly from a security perspective, many people feel like this allows them to be in a much more stable and secure environment going forward. Over the years, I've had a hand in recruiting a lot of physicians, and I've acquired. I've also been involved in acquisition of a lot of practices as well. And it's always interesting to talk to physicians after the fact, and I typically try to do this 6 months after the fact or whatever. Are you disappointed? Are you happy? Are you satisfied with the decision you made? What are the areas that you're concerned about or that you're disappointed in? What can you do to learn and not repeat, do better the next time, etc. This is interesting, a recent survey. This is not our data, this is national data. 70% of the physicians who went through an acquisition and employment said that that met their expectations. I'd like to see that a little bit higher, frankly, but a high percentage saw administrative burdens decrease, which is something we talked about a moment ago. Over half say they were successful at working fewer hours. A third made more money, 40% made about the same, and a large percentage said they'd do it again. So I think that's somewhat important to see sort of what the trends are, how physicians view this, because one thing I tell physicians, particularly in an employment arrangement, is it's not for everybody. It's not going to be perfect. There are certainly sacrifices they make in that relationship as well. And we really view it as a partnership. Even though we have physicians and we employ them, we want them to really think and act like they're still owners of the practice. I mean, they need to act like they're architects, not just inhabitants. And we really encourage that and try to stress that with physicians. Frankly, some embrace that more than others. I mean, to be honest, there's always going to be physicians who are just simply looking for an employment relationship, and that's it. They don't want to engage at any significant level. But that's just that's the world we live in. I mentioned this a moment ago. 70,000 physicians employed by hospitals, health systems. 2013, 125,000 were employed. That's actually, as I mentioned a moment ago, now that number is even greater. We'll see if I can continue to increase. Questions? I could go on, but I just want to give you a little bit of a flavor for sort of what we do, what we're seeing relative to physicians, and some of the trends, some of the challenges that we have. And I think going forward, from a Mountain States Health Alliance perspective, and certainly from a Ballard perspective, a lot of this, particularly on physicians, is going to be really, really critical for us, because we're going to be faced with putting resources in some of these markets in order to achieve the population health initiatives that we've committed to. It's just not going to happen on its own. And so these are things that are very important to us. How do we make this? Frankly, I'll be honest, if we had a choice in a perfect world, we wouldn't have to go out and employ physicians. I mean, we certainly don't consider ourselves the only solution for physicians. I'm not naive enough to think that physicians necessarily need us to do that. But the fact is, we need to be in a position where we can offer that as an alternative. And in some markets, I think it's going to be obvious that that's what it's going to take for us to get the physicians and the resources in those communities. Others, maybe not so much. If there is a way that we can partner or align with physicians, for example, through a clinically integrated network, which we're in the process of forming, or aligning around different payer contracts like we have with Medicare Shared Savings, that would be our preference, so that we can focus on running a health system and our hospitals and those kind of things. But that's the world we live in today. It's the reality. We're in the business. And so we want to try to be as good at it as we can and offer a good opportunity for physicians. Any questions about any of this?
What's your feeling on the physicians that don't want to sell their practice, say here, to Mountain States? So they close it and they go work somewhere else, like the VA or another healthcare system.
Right.
And maybe you've lost a great subspecialist or something. What's your feeling on that? And have you talked to them to see why they would prefer to do that than to, because we have seen that happen here.
Yeah. Well, the VA has been a challenge. We have lost physicians, some of whom are personal friends of mine that I've known for years, who have taken roles at the VA. And frankly, and I'm sure you guys are somewhat aware of what I'm referring to there, but I mean, in terms of how we compete, their retirement benefits there are just, we can't compete with them. And so when you've got an opportunity to go there and work for whatever period of time it is and be fully vested and all that, it's a very difficult. Now, it's also a very different, as you know, very different practice than it is with what we have to offer. So that's a concern, and I don't think there's anything we're going to be able to do to make that go away. That's just going to be something we're going to have to contend with. In cases where physicians close their practice, they retire, or they do whatever, there have been cases where we've been notified, I've been contacted by physicians that says, hey, I'm going to retire in a year. I don't have any plans for the practice. Do you have any, can you help me? And in some cases, we've helped them with recruiting a new person who could take the practice. In some cases, we've actually helped them with an acquisition of the practice, and we'll just take the patient charts and assign those to another existing practice in our system. So, I mean, I don't think there's one solution. There's not just a cookie cutter we take. It's every situation seems to be somewhat unique. And there are some cases where frankly, we recruit, we make an investment in recruitment, we get folks here, you know, it's moving expenses, it's sign-on bonuses, it's all the things that are required to get people here. And frankly, 2 or 3 years later, for whatever reason, their spouse doesn't like it or whatever, and they pick up and leave. And that's a setback too, right? Because we've made this huge investment, and now we've got folks who are leaving the community for whatever reason, get back closer to family, spouse wants to be in a bigger city or whatever. And so those are just challenges. I don't think there's anything you can do to prevent it. We do everything we can during the recruiting process to ensure that we have a good fit, that people are, you know, folks are going to be happy here. We do all the onboarding, all the orientation. We do everything we can to really integrate them. But that's just a risk that we have. Good question. Yes.
What are some of the other issues or concerns that administration has regarding the merger?
Well, that's a great question. There's several. Here's what I would say. A couple of things. You know, I've been fortunate to be in this market for most of my career, for most of the 30 years. And by the way, I'm not sure that makes me an expert. It's just, you know, maybe I've survived for 30 years doing different things maybe, but I have seen a lot, and I will tell you that, and I've sort of been on both sides of it. And I'll use level 1 trauma as a good example. There are 5, I think, level 1 traumas across the state of Tennessee, and there are 2 here within a few miles. It literally costs millions of dollars to operate and be successful with level 1 trauma. And if you think about the resources, it's not just the cost of the certification and all that, but it's the resources. It's attracting the quality trauma surgeons that you need to really support a region. And so the duplication that has existed, and competition's good. I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm a big believer, but healthcare is different. I mean, it's very, very capital intensive, and there is no question, I've seen it, the amount of money that has been spent in this region, in many cases, to do nothing more than duplicate and just this competitive nature that we've had. I'm not sure a lot of that has created value, frankly. And there's multiple examples of that. And that's one of the reasons, frankly, that not the only, but one of the reasons that this merger was even pursued. So I think some of the concerns are, now that we've got the terms of certification, now that we have Virginia's document, which we're still just trying to go through since we just got it Monday, is how we're going to be successful. Is how are we going to now merge 2 health systems, make all the decisions, merging 2 cultures, and all of those kind of issues, and then meet the requirements and the commitments that have been outlined in the documents from the state, both Tennessee and Virginia. I mean, it's going to be it's a huge undertaking, and I would say that's probably where my concern would start, and certainly most folks. And if you go through and look at the Population Health Index, and by the way, I think the document it's a public document. I think you can go to Tennessee.gov or Department of Health or whatever and get it. And when you start reading through the population health and the quality metrics that we're going to be held accountable for, and there's pass-fail. I mean, there's a pass-fail score on those. And so when you start looking at all those, it's pretty significant. And so we have made significant commitments, and it's going to be very important that we are in a position where we can be successful. And to do that, it's going to require a tremendous amount of work. You know, when you think about the market that we cover here and the geographic service area that we have responsibility for, so that would be where I would start with the concern.
How did you all come up with your fiscal year, like starting and ending dates, and is that going to change with the merger? Because I know like some people start in August and then other people start in January.
Yeah, you know, I don't know the answer to that. It existed when I came, and I do see a lot of organizations that have a July to June fiscal year. There are obviously many have calendar years. I I have not heard anything to suggest that that will change going forward. It might, but I guess the finance folks will help make some of those decisions. I mean, if there's some compelling reason to revisit that, I'm sure they will. Otherwise, my guess is they leave it alone. Yes?
With the decommissioning process, or sorry, with the merging process, is there gonna be a decommissioning process, or will all of the buildings still be occupied?
Yeah, another great question. And so we have committed in the, part of our commitment is that we, particularly Johnson City Medical Center, Bristol, Holston Valley, will remain acute care, tertiary type facilities. We do have certain things that we have pre-approval from the state to consolidate. And so some of those things were urgent care centers, for example, where we have lots of duplication with Wellmont, ambulatory surgery centers, some duplication in some of the rural markets. But for the most part, we're committed to maintain those facilities for a period of time. And if we choose to repurpose those in some form or fashion, we have to give appropriate notice and seek approval from the state and present a plan for doing so. Along those same lines, we've committed to not terminate without cause any team member in those rural facilities for a period of time. We also can't transfer those folks more than 30 miles for a period of time. So, I mean, we've made some pretty significant commitments. And again, I mean, if you think about it, that makes sense. I mean, the states, they understand the fact that we're going to have to consolidate some over a period of time. Their concern, and part of what they've written into these agreements, is obviously some commitment on our part to not just right out of the gate start slashing and eliminating and closing and so forth. So and we understand that, and we've agreed to those terms. So now in certain markets, and by the way, a lot of those decisions have not been made. You know, so we get questions all the time. Well, where is the level 1 trauma center going to be? Is it going to be in Kingsport or Johnson City? I don't know. The board, we had originally proposed, I think, a 17-member board. The state of Tennessee came back and has really demanded and required that we just have an 11-member board. That board, I will say it has yet to be identified. My guess is we probably have an idea who the 11 people will be. But the board and the management team and so forth, once they get placed, will be going through and making some of those decisions along with the clinical council. But none of those decisions have been made. So whether it be level 1 trauma, or are you going to do, you know, are you going to provide this service here or this service there? Those are going to be big decisions, and you can imagine that they're going to be emotional decisions in many cases too in the communities. So does that answer your question?
It does, thank you.
Yes.
You mentioned that merging cultures was a primary concern. How is Ballad going to address that?
Another great question. So early on, we did, there's been a ton of work that's been done, and one of the things that we did was a culture survey. So we hired an independent third party, I can't remember the name of the company, that came in and essentially did a culture survey of the two organizations. And then they presented those findings to both our board and Wellmont's board. And the idea was to try to identify areas from a cultural perspective where there were significant gaps or things that from a management perspective we really need to pay attention to in an effort to try to more effectively merge the cultures. And to be honest with you, there weren't a lot of differences. I mean, I think there's a little bit of in fact, I would say this, again, having spent 30 years here and knowing both systems and all, I think a lot of times folks think there are more differences in terms of the culture between the two than there really are. At the end of the day, most people from both places go to work in the morning and they do the same thing. They take care of patients. You know, they try to heal patients. They try to provide care to patients and their families. And I'm not sure there's a whole lot of difference. You know, the commitment that both organizations have in that regard, I think, is very similar. Now, you may say, well, from a management perspective, maybe there are some culture differences. And so there were a few things. You know, there's some differences in maybe how the boards have engaged, for example. But to be honest, what we found was essentially what I thought we would find, which is many more similarities than there were differences. But there was a specific effort made to address that. So that's a good question.
Moving forward, are they doing anything? Resurveying?
Yes, so that same firm will be engaged going forward. And again, there have been functional work groups that were established a couple of years ago around certain pieces of work related to the merger. So for example, I chair 2 of the functional work groups. One of them is physician operations and the other is retail operations. And so from an HR perspective, I mean, there's all these different functional work groups that involve people from both organizations, and they've tried to go through and identify, here are the things that we really need to be ready to achieve at closing, and then post-close, going forward, what are some of the initiatives that we need to be concerned with and so forth. And that, for example, is one thing. I can't remember if it's an HR functional work group or whatever, but yes, they'll be engaged going forward. Any other questions? Yes. It's 9:30, so.
Sure.
I thank you again for the opportunity to come. I know this has been probably a bit of a rambling type of thing, but I appreciate the opportunity to come and share with you a few of my ideas and thoughts. And I'll stick around if you have any questions. Look, this is an exciting time, really. And I say this to people all the time. I had a mentor, physician friend of mine for years that used to tell me, in a lot of meetings that we were in, he would always say that the practice of medicine was still an incredible joy for him. And it's an incredible responsibility and one that he took very seriously in spite of the challenges and the problems. But it's an exciting time right now with all the change. There's tremendous amounts of opportunity being created. So you guys are in a great place. And if I can do anything to help you or answer any questions, I'm more than happy to do it. And I wish you the best, and thank you again for the opportunity to be here today.
Thank you, Ray. Next break for the experts, I think, is in December, right?
Yes.
December
First week.
It's whatever that first Wednesday is in December.